This is an excerpt of the contact. It is an unauthorized and unofficial translation and may contain errors. Translated excerpt from the 655th Contact Conversation from Thursday, the 30th of June, 2016, 1:57 p.m.
It was about 10 years ago, when you told me that the EU dictatorship will begin negotiations with Canada in a secret way on a trade agreement, which will be damage-bringing in regards to the state welfare services for the populations, as also however for the already weak democracy efforts and the environmental protection of the countries of the EU dictatorship. Thereby you have spoken of CETA, 1, as this is also publicly the case today. If you can openly say please, what exactly is behind this agreement with CETA? Because at that time you said that for the people of Europe it will concern underhanded and widely damage-bringing agreements between the EU dictatorship and Canada.
First, I must explain another time that we, with regard to the EU, effectively and time again, must point to the fact that it concerns a dictatorship too, and that this fact must be mentioned time and again, because a great many EU advocates in Switzerland and in the EU dictatorship itself, in their clueless mode of thinking and assessment incapability, do not recognize the reality and its truth, and also cannot comprehend it. Fact is that the EU Dictatorship Commission, 3, as I explanatorily foretold to you in 1996, from 2009 onwards negotiated with Canada under strict secrecy over a trade and investment protection agreement, which is called CETA, that is Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. As a dictatorship, the public was also excluded from the whole thing by the EU, of course, as well as all parliaments of countries of the EU dictatorship. Because, however, already for many years the lobbyism has won great might in many states of the earth, business lobbyists also received a massive influence on the text of the contract, which was then made public only years later, namely in 2014 after the conclusion of negotiations in this matter. However, what truthfully developed from it, and indeed in a very negative wise, is concealed very wisely because everything disadvantageous will move in similar forms as with the TIP Agreement 5 between the USA and the EU dictatorship. Foreseeable and predictable is the fact that with CETA a massive dismantling of the otherwise already weak democracies in the countries of the EU dictatorship took place, as well as with the public's living provision and lifetime care, whilst also the protection of the environment was neglected more and more, and by ceasing to apply controls and prohibitions with regard to toxic substances in food products, each population of the countries of the EU dictatorship is damaged health-wise, etc.
Look here, to my question and your answer, I have tried to investigate things in the internet and have found the following. www.attack.de CETA is the first trade agreement of the EU, which provides private arbitration courts. Companies may sue the contracting states before tribunals if they see their future profit expectations restricted due to legislations. Thus, complaints into the billions come up to the states. At the same time, the leeway in favor of a legislation for the common good is substantially curtailed. Above all, transnational concerns will profit. Many of the largest U.S. firms maintain branch offices in Canada. Via CETA they would be able to sue EU states, even if the TIP agreement between the USA and the EU fails. CETA will be binding under international law and can scarcely be rescinded. The infamous zombie clause in Chapter 34 even provides for the unlikely event of a dissolution of CETA, so that the right to sue for investors still remains another 20 years. In addition, CETA is designed as a living agreement. A board of regulators from non-elected bureaucrats shall examine legislative proposals to see whether they could negatively affect commercial interests. Corporate lobbyists will thereby open the floodgates to withdraw disagreeable bills from circulation, even before parliaments and the public find out about it. Even any subsequent change or extension of the contract without democratic control is possible. Privatization and erosion of public services. Unlike most previous trade agreements, CETA does not list the areas to be liberalized, but only the exceptions. Negative list. Thus a wide and indeterminate field becomes consigned to the compulsion for privatization and deregulation. Once deregulated and privatized, areas may no longer be taken back. Standstill, and safety catch/pall clauses. CETA provides no clear, fundamental exemption from the liberalization of public services. Furthermore, CETA calls into question ecological and social award criteria in the public procurement, and therefore a key element in the local self-government. Even social and labor standards are at risk of undermining by CETA. Foreign investors could sue under CETA, even against new taxes and fees, such as a property tax. Public funding of cultural institutions is also jeopardized. Door opener for genetic engineering, fracking and dirty tar sands. CETA undermines existing environmental standards and limits future environmental legislation. For example, the import ban of the EU for the extremely climate-damaging crude oil from Canadian tar sands was softened already during the CETA negotiations. Under CETA, companies could also bring in action, sue, against a possible future ban of shale gas extraction, fracking. Fracking is suspected of poisoning the groundwater by the use of chemicals and even triggering earthquakes. Canada has already been sued under the CETA similar NAFTA agreement, after which the province of Quebec had stopped fracking. CETA replaced the precautionary principle valid in the EU by a principle that is said to be science-based. Potentially dangerous products and technologies can therefore only be pulled from the market if their harmfulness is proved beyond doubt, and thus often much too late. In this way, genetic engineering may come to our table, again through the back door. Stop CETA, tip and TISA. CETA is yet to be ratified in 2016. Help to defend democracy, common good and the environment against this coup of the corporations. Demand accountability from your deputies in the EU Parliament. CETA is deemed to be a mixed agreement, which also must be ratified by the Bundestag and Bundesrat. Exert pressure on your representatives in the Bundestag and in the state parliaments. 5 federal state elections take place in 2016.
These are indisputable facts.
I think so too, but the whole thing goes even further, because in a private conversation at that time, it was summer, you had also told me that apart from that, the EU dictatorship secretly also worked to find a way and to build up to it, in order to have a say in their might greed, hypocritically only indirectly at first, but already plans in the course of time to also directly intervene into the affairs of government and the decisions, etc. of the countries of the EU dictatorship. Could you say something more about this, please?
In fact, for quite some time already, plans have been forged and worked out in a secretive wise between the mightful ones of the EU dictatorship, which tend to intervene, at first indirectly, but then in a direct wise and determining the parliaments of all the countries of the EU dictatorship. The up until now still secret plan corresponds firstly to the purpose of an insidious intervention in the parliaments of individual EU member states, and namely in the wise to adopt all state business to be decided in accordance with the forms of the EU dictatorship. It is secondly already set in the secret plans that from this first measure proceeds the second and shall be directed to align the whole system of government of all EU member states to the absolutely authoritarian, repressive and totalitarian EU dictatorship forms, as a result of which all of the EU dictatorship-affiliated states shall lose their sovereignty. In this wise, if the EU dictatorship can prevail, planned as a final outcome is the absolute submission of the governments of all EU member states under the direct might of the EU dictatorship in Brussels. Consequently, no EU member state will then exist independently any longer. Thus all countries that have joined the EU dictatorship, and if this can be achieved in accordance with their secret plans, will become satellite states, that is vassal states and thereby smallish states, that find themselves in a dependent relationship to the totalitarian EU dictatorship and will be absolutely integrated into its suzerainty, without being able to even free themselves of it. And if this occurs, that the whole of this secret plan is realized, then the EU dictatorship will form into an absolutely European-dominating as well as world-threatening military superpower. So all EU dictatorship countries would only formally be independent and would become politically enslaved directly by the suzerainty and totalitarian EU dictatorship. And if the mightful ones of the EU dictatorship will be successful with these malicious, nefarious and underhanded intrigues and deviousness, then eventually all EU dictatorship member states will effectively become only just feigned states with quasi-governments, which are extensively enslaved directly by the mightful ones of the EU dictatorship in Brussels, and then only have to do that which they are commanded. Thereby, then no opposition will imperiously be tolerated any longer by the EU dictatorship, and the dictatorial governmental administrative measures will lie unequivocally with the EU dictatorship hegemony. 6.
The whole thing looks bleak, especially also because there are too many lowly intelligent and simple-minded EU advocates in each country who shout for and cheer and do everything to fill chock full of the criminal and even criminal necks of the EU dictatorship. And if I consider that rational human beings of the EU countries cannot agree with everything and will demonstrate because of that, then I shudder to think of the fact that the EU dictatorship has reintroduced the death penalty and allows that demonstrators can simply be knocked off or sentenced to the death.
This is indeed a very serious matter.
Indeed. Now England has indeed said goodbye to the EU dictatorship, but as I see it, on the one hand the Scots and around 48% of the English are indeed crazy and pathologically dumb, that they continue to flirt with the EU dictatorship and are willing to let themselves be subjugated by it and enslaved. Now on the other hand, the henchmen of the EU dictatorship, namely with the might greedy and reality estranged naive German Chancelloress Merkel leading the way as well as Juncker and Schulz, are attempting to terrorize England, so that Britain gets out as soon as possible from the dictatorship. And as for my assessment of the matter, now the whole smear campaign against England by the criminal EU dictators Juncker and Schulz, etc., as well as the EU dictator Merkel, is driven out of sheer hatred and brainless revenge, in order to punish and drive England into hardship and misery. And thereby also playing with the deceitful idea that by another and repeat vote sooner or later, England piles into the EU dictatorship, just as that which the sick blockheads of Scotland indeed also strive for, which is why they secede from England and want to be independent. And what more is to be said, based on the fact that when the federal speeches are held in Germany, that neither Angela Merkel nor her like-minded dependents concern themselves with that which their opponents rightly state in their speeches and in accordance with the truth. So I was frequently able to observe on television that for one thing the reality estranged naive Chancelloress and her subservient skulkers and at the back only grin stupidly and maliciously, babble with their peers or read newspapers, etc. Thus the rational ones who are familiar with thinking over the effective facts and also name them, such as Sarah Wagenknecht at the forefront, born in 1969, who works as a German economist, journalist and politician has no chance to be able to get through with the power-obsessed ones and politically achieve something of value.
It is absolutely without question and without a doubt that everything is indeed just as you say, and you rightfully highlight the politician Sarah Wagenknecht, because this woman in every respect sees the effective facts correctly and is also courageously committed in every wise. For this, however, she will be insulted in the wake of the stupidity of the reality-estranged, naive, and power-crazed Merkel and her subservient vassals, and through this attempted to bring into ridicule, as the Merkel henchmen twist and misrepresent the effective facts, in order to thereby confuse and to draw many to their side. But even those Scots, of whom you speak, are really dull with regard to the truth recognition concerning the EU, and are neither able to recognize nor to understand how dictatorially dangerous and devious the EU dictatorship really is. Regarding the EU itself, The dictatorial mindful ones are not capable of dealing with the fact that the majority of the English population recognized the European Union as a dictatorship and has voted in favor of a withdrawal from it. In fact, nothing better could be done, and thus in some circumstances also the beginnings for it are created, that also populations of other countries which have joined the EU dictatorship free themselves again from it, especially now if prudent rulers of these states take the necessary steps for a break with the EU dictatorship. With the whole thing also, fact is that already for some time now, large parts of the population of various EU dictatorship countries regret the EU membership and would like to pull out of the dictatorship, which however is prevented, unfortunately, by fools from the population as well as by the power-obsessed rulers.
Perhaps there comes a time in which, owing to bad advice, the whole EU dictatorship goes down the drain, and all its lowly intelligent and simple-minded henchmen and advocates kick themselves with rage in their own bottom. But let's leave that, because I would like to address something another time, about which we have again also recently communicated.